Darkcast Network. Come to the dark side of podcasts. We have cookies.
Cookies? Me love cookies.
Are you looking for your next true crime podcast? Do you crave stories that have mystery and suspense? Well, look no further. Introducing Love and Murder, the podcast that dives deep into the world of relationships gone horribly wrong. Every week, I take you on a journey through the dark side of love, where passion turns into obsession, family becomes enemies, and romance turns to murder. So why should you listen to Love and Murder? Because this is not just another true crime podcast. We're your partners in crime, your storytellers, and your weekly dose of suspenseful entertainment. So what are you waiting for? Join the LAM community, www.murderandlove.com. That's Love and Murder backwards, murderandlove.com. See you soon.
Hey, I talk smack sometimes with foul language. I also talk about sex and murder. Listener discretion is strongly recommended. Hey there, Rainbow Warriors. Welcome to Beyond the Rainbow, True Crimes of the LGBTQ. I'm your host, CJ. First off, a big thank you to Allen, Texas, who has the highest number of listens to me in all the United States. You warriors have knocked California out of my top state spot, and you put Texas there. You guys rock! And I've got to be honest with y'all, I'm happy to still be here and alive. You know how I like to share my life tidbits with you. I had a pretty bad fall last week. It was around 11 p.m. at night, and I had a bowl of wet cat food in one hand and a bowl of wet dog food in the other. It was dinner for my pets, not me trying to snare a late snack, I promise. Anywho, I was starting to get tired, but I knew I had to complete my chores for the night, and that included feeding my pets. So up the stairs of my house I went to feed the animals. I got to the 5th step, and I'm not sure what happened, but I felt myself falling backwards. Somehow I managed to miraculously put each bowl on a step before I fell, but then I went. It all happened so fast, but when I fell to the 3rd step, I was kind of relieved because I thought I caught myself, but I hadn't. And I propelled down to the very bottom of the stairs, and that's where my head hit the ceramic tile floor. Twice. Because once for me apparently isn't good enough. Thankfully, my daughter and her boyfriend heard me crash and they came running. I was just laying there with my head in pain, asking him not to touch me. The boyfriend got me an ice pack. Okay, it was a bag of dark chocolate chips that I keep in the freezer. Don't judge. After several minutes, I stood, but my head hurt so much. I made my daughter look to see if I had split it open, but I hadn't. However, there was a huge bump forming on the back of my noggin, and I wanted to go to sleep so badly. I forced myself to stay awake for a few more hours. And then I noticed another lump, and it was on my temple, so I guess my head thumped the tile twice. A headache graced me with its presence, too. Hours later, I went to bed, but my daughter was so scared that once I fell asleep, I would never wake up again. Because I guess I'm Sleeping Beauty. So she came in and she woke me. I spoke gibberish to her and I fell back asleep. The next few days were pretty painful with headaches and neck and shoulder pain. But later in the week I was good and still alive. And I'm here with you now. And that's kinda why this episode's a bit late. Oh, and by the way, I can't seem to get that Boy George and the Culture Club song, I'll Tumble For You, out of my head. I may have to make it my personal theme song. I'd like to talk a little about gay guys. I love them, but in particular I'd like to talk about gay guys from my youthful days. I remember hearing in the late 80s and early 90s that gay guys were fuckboys, hoes, sluts. There was not one among them who could have a monogamous relationship because their dicks were wild and untamed. In the mid-90s, early 2000s, I was pleased to have formed some friendships with gay male couples, and they proved that fuckboy stigma Totally wrong. At least I knew then that not all gay men were promiscuous. However, there had to be at least a little truth to the aforementioned rumor, because in my experience, most rumors and jokes have a little bit of honesty to them. And I did know some slutty gay guys, but most weren't in committed relationships at the time. I guess in hindsight, they weren't really slutty gay guys, and I certainly don't want to slut-shame anyone, so I searched for a more appropriate term. I believe gay allosexual might be the correct umbrella phrase for these guys who just enjoyed sex with many male partners, and this was whether they were in an open relationship or not. You guys, there are so many different sexuals out there, and as I learn about them, I just kind of want to share the definitions with you. I think it's kind of fascinating, and I hope you do too. Okay, let's get into our episode's main case. 46-year-old Stephen Patrick White, who went by Steve, he was a gay but manly dude. He was also chasing demons of alcoholism within himself. Steve was in a relationship with a man named Alex Till, although in August of 2014, their relationship was going through a very rough patch due to Steve's drinking issues. The couple still lived together, they spent time together, and they even shared a bed together. But their relationship was on a sort of break, and the two decided to make their relationship open. Months later, on November 8th, Alex and Steve had dinner plans. They were going to discuss their relationship and Steve's drinking problem. But we'll get back to this dinner date in a little bit. I'd first like to lay some background information on Steve. Steve grew up in a conservative family in Greensboro, North Carolina. He served in the Army because he wanted to follow a path that his father had first taken. Steve was deployed to South Korea, where he served for 4 years under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell fiasco, before he returned home to Greensboro. When he returned home, Steve was ready to start attending college. But college seemed to be a fleeting dream because he accepted a job with the U.S. Border Patrol. He was guarding the U.S.-Mexican border. But that job became kind of boring to him, so he accepted employment as an air marshal. In 2005, he was ready yet for another job, and he took one with a private security firm called Blackwater. For this job, he was relocating to Iraq for a while as a special security officer. And between you and me, being gay in Iraq, that's some scary-ass shit right there. The night before Steve left, he came out as gay to his mom, dad, brother, and sister. As conservative as his family was, they all seemed to be okay with his being gay. This was a huge relief for Steve. His family loved him no matter what. It was a super religious extended family who were not okay with Steve's truth. But fuck them, am I right? Through his years, Steve became hyper-masculine. He never wanted to appear feminine or weak. Once he came out, the facade he lived under lessened a bit, and those who knew and loved him still saw the same old Steve, no different than when he lived in his closet. He aspired to start a non-profit organization someday. He wanted to help highly closeted gay people come out and see them through the process every step of the way, especially military personnel. But sometimes, life just has a way of shattering our dreams. A couple of weeks into his new job in Iraq, Steve was part of a group that was hit with a mortar attack. Once the mortar fires started, Steve and the group he was in, they headed downstairs for a safety shelter and they shut the door tightly. But the mortar came down the stairs and blew the door off its hinges. Steve's good friend, who was right next to him, he was killed in the explosion. His body fell on Steve's, covering him and protecting Steve from further mortar blasts. Now, while his friend's body took most of the hits, Steve did not come out unscathed. His jaw was knocked askew, his arms and legs suffered major damage, and at a hospital in Iraq, the doctors thought he was going to die. But Steve fought through, and over time he healed from most of his injuries. Months later, Steve, who was now on disability, was able to fly home to Greensboro. But he was also bringing home some PTSD from the incident. And like many of us, when we suffer from something emotional, even physically traumatic, he found his coping mechanism in alcohol consumption. Alex Teal met Steve and instantly fell for him, and he too came from a military family background. He heard of Steve's military stint and of his injuries in Iraq. He admired and lusted over Steve from a distance for about a year and a half. He kept his distance because he learned Steve had a boyfriend. But just when he found out Steve was newly single again, Alex swooped in and the two became involved in a relationship. All right, now, let's go back to that dinner date between Alex and Steve on November 8, 2014. The couple went to one of Steve's favorite steakhouses for dinner. They were to discuss Steve's troubles with alcohol. The alcoholism had become a growing issue in their relationship. Sometime during their dinner, the two decided to take their relationship to the next level, and they wanted to get married, since at this time it was now legal for same-sex couples to do this in North Carolina. But Alex did tell Steve before this could happen, he needed Steve to get help for his addiction. Steve agreed and told him, "I will. I want to keep you. I want to get married." After their romantic and honest dinner, Alex told Steve to go out and spend one last night celebrating, because the next day they were going to start their new, sober, monogamous life journey together. Steve went to a bar called Chemistry after he left his now fiancée, Alex, after dinner. Steve chose this LGBTQ bar to ride out his last wild night of an open relationship and drinking. During a drag show performance, 26-year-old Gary Gupton would enter Chemistry. After the show, Gary approached drag performer Kimberly DeLorean. He talked with her and said he'd never been with a man before. To Kimberly, he seemed ready to change that. Kimberly had to leave their conversation and get ready for the next show. Gary went up to the bar to order himself some drinks. The night's bartender, Jim, noticed that Gary seemed very uneasy at first, but the more drinks he consumed, the more comfortable he became. Gary perused around the bar talking to various patrons, and then he settled back near the bartender, and then he admitted it was his first time at a gay club. After the second drag show of the night, Kimberly went back by Gary, and Gary became a little handsy and touchy-feely with the man in drag. Kimberly excused herself. Steve, who was also at the bar, was entertaining another man. That man stood, kissed Steve on the cheek, and disappeared, and now Steve was left alone. Steve noticed Gary, who by now was crying a little, and he looked very distraught. He started a conversation with Gary. It was near closing time for the club, and the two talked and talked until most of the bar cleared out. According to Jim the bartender, they talked mostly about coming out. If you recall, helping gay men come out was something that Steve really wanted to help others with. Finally, Steve asked Jim to call him a cab. At the closing of Chemistry for the night, Steve and Gary left together in a cab. Jim the bartender told Gary to take care of Steve because he really liked him. Their destination was a hotel called the Battleground Inn. Both of the men, well, they were pretty intoxicated. But they arrived at the hotel, checked in, and 2 hours later, fire alarms started to blast through the Battleground Inn, along with the sounds of a man screaming. Meanwhile, at home, Alex awoke. It was 3 a.m. and Steve still wasn't home. He thought maybe Steve had gone to an after-party somewhere, so he called Steve's cell phone, but it was going right to the voicemail. Alex started to panic. At the Battleground Inn, a hotel clerk received a call from one of the hotel guests. The guest said not only was the alarm unbearable, but there was also a man screaming in the room near them. At that same moment, Gary came down to the hotel lobby, acting very erratic. He was yelling and knocking the computer monitor off the clerk's desk, and he threw a cigarette lighter behind the desk. The clerk immediately called 911 to report Gary's behavior. The clerk then hurried up to the 4th floor where Gary and Steve's room was located. The clerk saw smoke coming from under the door as the alarm still blared. The clerk called 911 to now report the fire. When the fire department personnel arrived at the Battleground Inn, they evacuated the hotel. They got to the fire on the 4th floor in the one hotel room, and then they contained the fire. They also found a naked man lying inside, face down, wrapped in a burning comforter with furniture stacked on top of him. Somehow the man was still alive, though he seemingly was suffering from burns over at least 50% of his body and blunt force injuries to his head. This man was Steve. He was still smoldering when the first responders removed him on a gurney from the building, and he was rushed to the hospital. When law enforcement arrived, they found Gary in the parking lot. He was screaming at them to evacuate as an Islamic terrorist group had bombs inside the hotel. Gary was arrested on a variety of charges, including assault and attempted murder, as well as arson. In the hospital, Steve was in bad shape. He'd been beaten with a rotary phone in the motel room and strangled with the phone cord. A television and other items were thrown on top of him, and he had the hotel's comforter folded up around him and lit on fire. Both of his arms were so badly burned they had to be amputated. After 2 weeks of fighting, Steve just couldn't do it anymore, and he died. Gary's charges were now amped up to first-degree murder and first-degree arson. Nearly 3 years later, in October of 2017, Gary's trial proceeded. His defense claimed innocent by reasons of insanity, but the jury found Gary guilty on both first-degree murder and first-degree arson. Gary was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Steve, and an additional 64 to 89 months for the arson. Gary has since appealed on grounds that there were errors in his original trial. The court ruled that there were no errors, and Gary's sentence stands as of today. Alex continues on with only memories of his beloved fiancée. Rest in power, Steve. Our True Crime Quickie comes to us from the tropical resort city of Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, in the year 2008. And as odd as this may sound, our victim wrote her own obituary back in 1999. She was a trans woman, and her name was Felicia Melton-Smyth. She was an AIDS and trans activist. She was murdered at the age of 41 while vacationing in Puerto Vallarta. But the obituary she wrote said,
I was born in Dodgeville, Wisconsin, and I was raised by a loving, caring, and supportive father, Gerald Lee Frame. I was raised with a sister, Tammy, who has 2 children, Benjamin and Kyla Ashbacher. I graduated from Wisconsin Heights High School, Mazamani, in 1985. I attended college at Capri Cosmetology College and MATC Madison for computer programming, accounting, and fashion design. After college, I moved to Phoenix, Arizona for 2 years, but I missed the 4 seasons, my family, and my friends, and I moved back to Madison, Wisconsin. I started working at the Shamrock Bar Madison in 1987 and at the University Wisconsin Health Medical Foundation in 1994. One other noteworthy employment was at the Cafe Palms in the historic Hotel Washington. During this time, I became a very well-known female impersonator, and I won many city and state beauty talent pageants. In the early 80s, I assisted with the care of several people living with the HIV/AIDS virus, and I became an advocate for HIV/AIDS patients through the Madison AIDS Network. With the support of my father, family, and friends, I became who I was always meant to be. I continued to work at the Shamrock and the UW Health Medical Foundation. My volunteer work continued with the AIDS Network as well, I started to work for an online travel agency, justterry.com, in 2005, and I traveled frequently to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. I served on 2 different gay athletic boards, the Madison Gay Hockey Association and the Madison GLBT Softball League. In 2002, I started a holiday gift-giving project for families that had at least one person infected with HIV/AIDS and granted holiday wishes to those families, both the adults and the children. I was also recognized by Congresswoman Tammy Baldwin and former President of the United States Bill Clinton for the work I'd been doing with families with HIV/AIDS in 2005. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Amen. Being brought up Baptist, I recited religiously the same prayer for many years every night before I went to sleep. This prayer scared me that I might not make it through the night, saying it would make the Lord keep my soul. I feel that fear was the motivation of this prayer. I wish someone would have comforted me instead of scaring me. I ask you, with all the religions out there, who is right? How did the universe get created? What happens when we die? These are questions I see that no one can answer. Whether you believe in prayer or not, I believe in a higher power of love, rather than a world of fear and hate. Some people say that it's morbid to write my own obituary, but I see it as a way to say what I want said about me. I've been very lucky as an individual, that I have a loving family and friends, a very successful career, a home, a car, and material things. Most people like me aren't as lucky and they struggle in life. My father once said that I am the only person that can make me happy, and it's true. I've lived every day to its fullest and I have no regrets. I want everyone to know that I loved being alive, and now that I'm gone, I want to invite everyone to meet my family and friends at a gathering at the West Side Businessman's Club. Come meet my family and friends and help celebrate my life. And now, I will say goodbye, my friends. Love, Felicia Melton-Smyth.
Felicia must have seen her demise coming to have gone and written herself an obituary. In May of 2008, Felicia was having a working vacation in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. She was staying alone at the Brises Del Mar Hotel, and she met a man named Francisco Holos. Francisco looked a little lost to her, so she started up a conversation with him. He had only been in Puerto Vallarta a few days, and he had no place to stay, and he had no money. Felicia took pity on the man, and she offered to let him stay with her. And I'd just like to take a second to sidebar here. Back in 2008, media was still calling transgender people transsexuals. Even the online magazine called The Advocate, which is a queer magazine. Amazing to me that even in the late 2000s, we were still using the wrong terminology. Okay, so Felicia brought this man, Francisco, back to her room with her. That night, Francisco stabbed Felicia to death. He was picked up by the Mexican police and arrested. Francisco told the police that he stabbed her because she did not pay him for sex. Say what, homeboy? You should have been paying her, if anything. Felicia was kind enough to give you a warm, soft place to sleep for the night. Back in her home in Madison, Wisconsin, the LGBTQ community, her family, and her friends were totally devastated. Felicia was a good person who loved helping others. Growing up, her 2 best friends from high school contracted AIDS, and she stayed with them and took care of them until they passed away. Caring for them was the reason she wanted to help people with HIV. She planned and organized many fundraising events to assist families whose children contracted the autoimmune deficiency disorder known as AIDS. Felicia was also never scared to live her truth. Even as a boy child, she knew who she was in spite of teasing and mean kids who might have picked on her. In her first grade play, she was totally bummed out being cast as Prince Charming, and she absolutely refused to kiss Cinderella. In fourth grade, she was ecstatic being cast as a girl's part because she could wear a dress. And I just love how supportive her father was of her truth as well. Rest in power, Felicia. I love you, Rainbow Warriors. You matter. And remember, it's not a crime to be gay, unless you're a murderer.